everybody for having me here today. This is my second time, as Dr. Vinod said, of doing the lecture at TU. It's very important to me to be able to share the information that we're collecting here and the ideas that we have with all of you. And I'm very interested in your feedback. I ask that, as it was explained, that I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes and then take questions afterward. And please note your questions as I go, and it'll be wonderful to get your feedback. So the talk I'm presenting today is called Understanding the Recovery from the 2015 Nepal Earthquakes, Resilience and Change. And this project is a response by me to the Nepal earthquakes to try and do some research that was applicable to Nepal now and in the future. I've been working in Nepal since 2004, and my research was a little bit different before, and I was studying the relationship between different cultures in Solukhumbu and the environment. After the earthquakes happened, I decided to change what I do, and I wanted to look at how different communities are recovering from the earthquakes. So this project is an example of that. It is an all Nepali team that is behind this project. My research coordinator, Alyssa Rai, is here today also. She's in the back and won't be embarrassed by that, but I'm very happy to have her here. And she'll also add some things that maybe I'm forgetting, as she has been involved in every aspect of the research. I'm also videotaping the lecture today. I hope that's okay with everyone, so that we can put it online and more people can watch the lecture later. Feel free to record, take pictures, whatever you want. I'm sure my head will be very shiny, so be careful with the flap. Okay. So I don't need to explain to anybody about the earthquake. I'm sure everybody here experienced the earthquake in 2015. We actually are focusing on two earthquakes, the April 25th earthquake and the May 12th earthquakes. Both of them caused catastrophic damage to property and life in Nepal, and also destroyed or damaged more than 700,000 structures. And I want folks to keep that in mind, because the idea of rebuilding 700,000 structures, not just the material aspect of that, but the lives that this has disrupted, is going to take a very long time. And I want us to think about terms like relief versus recovery, because they mean different things. Or maybe let's get rid of the term recovery and use the word reconstruction, so that we know that there are different kinds and ways and processes of how this happens. I'm going to start and go right into our study, and it is woven in with some theory from the Anthropology of disaster, but we are so excited to be able to present to you now some of our results. So I'm going to focus mostly on that, so that you can get the meat of what we're doing and give us some feedback on what you think, because we're not making recommendations yet. The whole time that I'm here, the focus is presenting the data and getting feedback so that we can make it more useful for the future. So I want to start with this quote from one of the study areas that we're working in about the earthquake. Why the earthquake came cannot be explained. There used to be a popular saying, a kind of riddle that we used to hear when we were kids. It says, "Tell me one thing that the subjects do not want and that the king also does not want." Actually, nobody wants this thing. What is this thing, they would ask? It is the earthquake. This was how we thought of the earthquake, as a thing that nobody wants. So in our study, we're specifically interested in the contributions of what we're going to call domains of resilience. And that's a lot of words to just mean different factors that we think are most important in how people respond to natural hazards and natural disasters. And what we decided to pick as our variables in this study are accessibility and hazard exposure, institutional context, livelihood diversity, connectivity, and social memory. Each one of these domains is represented by many different variables. And we are mixed methods researchers, so we're using both quantitative and qualitative information in order to answer our research questions. And our variables were created through long-term ethnographic research in Nepal, and also collaborations in our study areas by talking to the people in which we're working with and helping to flush out what's most important in those places, because of course you can't study everything. So we actually borrowed from the resilience literature and from what folks in ecology would use, and use something called the rule of hand. The rule of hand is a way of taking a complex system and breaking it down into parts and trying to think what are the most important parts for how that system functions. So we went into the research and we found folks doing this in ecology, because in ecology you have to deal with multiple variables, both independent and dependent variables, and we understand that a lot of things are all going on at the same time. So this is a way of trying to make sense of complexity. And if we're studying too many things, it would get too fuzzy and it would make it really hard for us to understand what the dynamics are. Our research then focuses on these 5 different domains that you'll learn a lot more about, and we link it to the household level using quantitative and qualitative methods. We also followed household demographics in our study, settlement demographics, and recovery indicator over time using our approaches. So the 5 domains of resilience, we created 5 different research questions to understand them. And I think this will bring to life for you what we're trying to look at in this study and how we're trying to quote unquote measure resilience. 1 is accessibility and hazard exposure. How do geographic and accessibility and biophysical vulnerability influence household resilience and change following natural disasters? What is the influence of participation in the governance system and the formal and informal institutions that exist within it? What are the roles of heterogeneity of income and patterns of resource use? How influential are flows of information, knowledge, and resources between households, linkages between households and external actors, and what are the roles of bonding and bridging forms of social capital, which I know a lot of folks here are interested in? Lastly, we're looking at social memory. What is the influence of prior experience with natural hazards, and what is the role of local knowledge in recovery? So taking these 5 research questions within our 5 domains of resilience that we selected using the rule of hand, we then also were trying to understand some recovery indicators. How are we going to look at what recovery from the earthquakes are? So, of course, there are tangible and intangible aspects of recovery. It's easy to think about the idea of rebuilding a house as recovery, right? House destroyed, house rebuilt. But there are other factors like people's livelihoods. There are other factors like place-based knowledge or spiritual connections with communities, or even communities being together with the same ethnic group that then get broken apart by these different disturbances. So for our recovery indicators in the quantitative sense, we picked these different variables: home reconstruction and able to return to home from temporary shelter, issues with home construction, recovery of livestock and herding practice, recovery of livestock, selling of livestock products, recovery of access to and use of different agricultural lands, standing crops and seed storage, ability to work in wage labor, ability to work in tourism, access to electricity, and access to communications technology. And the reason why there are positives and negatives next to each one is that if these indicators came out in our research as a positive, for example, were you able to return home? Yes, that's a good thing. But if you're having issues with your home construction, yes, that's a bad thing, right? So these are the directions that our different variables go, and in the type of statistics that we used, this helps you understand how the results are. This is a model that'll try and help bring it to life a little bit for everybody here. Here is our accessibility and hazard exposure, and we believe it's acting on all those different 4 domains we were talking about: institutional context, livelihood diversity, connectivity, social memory, and all of that together are yielding recovery indicators, okay? And remember, this model is moving, okay? People are changing, communities start in their own place, and there are things influencing this, like an election coming up, for example, or cascading effects from natural disasters like landslides, which get activated from an earthquake, but then continue, for example, through heavy rains in a monsoon, which you're going to hear all about in a minute. I'm going to populate the model, okay? So you still see the original model here, but these are all the points of data that we're feeding into this model. The ones in blue are quantitative, the ones in purple are qualitative. I understand you probably can't see this whole thing because your eyes might be hurting looking at it, but by and large it's trying to explain how we're measuring hazard exposure, like access to your fields, access to your grazing areas, whether or not you're near or far from a road, how far you are from the nearest landslide. Institutional context includes people's participation in local committees, or what we call decentralized governance, and also participation in the new government, right? There's been an election since we were here, and there's going to be an election tomorrow, and there's going to be an election on December 7th, and that's going to continue moving this model. We also are looking at whether or not people from the community's ideas are being integrated into programs, for example, in governance, and that's more of a qualitative question. We're also looking at livelihood diversity. How many streams of income do households have? Are they just herders? Are they just farmers? Do they work in the service industry? Do they go out for wage labor? These are all different things that might affect the way that recovery happens. We're also looking at how those trajectories might change. A great idea, or a great example to bring that to life, would be in farming. Are people changing the crops that they're growing in order to get a faster yield after the earthquake because they need to get something going? Their land's been affected, there's been a great disturbance. Maybe folks are starting to use pesticides. Maybe they've changed what their livestock is from having a lot of bovines to goats and sheep because they eat and are more accessible to grazing areas. Those are some of the questions we're also looking at. Connectivity, lots of folks talk about this in Nepal. It includes everything from remittances, when you have folks working abroad and sending money back. It also includes whether or not you have connectivity to we'll say Kathmandu and people living there, whether or not you have connectivity with NGOs and INGOs, with international organizations, and what kind of information is being exchanged and resources through that connectivity. Does that matter in recovery? Social memory, something I have a lot of experience with, is whether or not people have memories of previous earthquakes or landslides, and do these help or hinder folks from recovery? Do they have knowledge of terracing, of farming? So if their terraces are gone, can they remake new ones? What if they can't get to the forests where they harvest their non-timber forest products? Do they have memory of what to do to change that? A great example of this was the changing of water sources. I'm sure folks heard that the earthquake changed the water table. And where the water once came out in some places, it didn't come out anymore, and folks had to source new water. Had they done that before? And was there resilience to that built within the culture? And then lastly, this equates to whether or not those are equating into recovery. Are they helping folks to rebuild their homes? Is this helping folks to rebuild faster? Is this helping folks to get their lives to move on? Or maybe these things are hurting folks from moving on, okay? And I'm gonna kind of put that in your mind, that recovery can also go backwards, right? And folks can be in a worse position after the earthquake than they were 1 year, 2 years after. Things might be worse than they were right after the earthquake, okay? The earthquake hit sometimes can just start something that then gets worse and worse, and we'll talk about that too. Okay, so the broader impacts of this research, it can help the government and aid communities in future disaster contexts to be more aware of complexity and build on resilience. How can we help the INGOs, the government, the policymakers to utilize the resources that are already there rather than thinking and bringing outside ideas in? Natural disasters in the literature can be considered focusing events. They put under a microscope issues that are already there. I'm sure folks here heard the nickname of the earthquake as a class quake. Yeah? Well, that's a way of explaining that the poorest people got hurt the worst in the earthquake. That's a focusing event. The earthquake brought to the surface that the people that are more marginal are having a harder time recovering. This also can facilitate desired recovery outcomes by partnering with people. We're having a national workshop on Wednesday with INGOs, the Nepal Rebuilding Authority, applied academics, and our hope is that this research can help think of better ways to plan in the future, be it in the communities we're working in, but also in future disaster events. So one thing that we've tried to do is get the word out on this research. So I haven't written any academic papers yet, but I've written a lot of wide audience and social media aspects so that the story of what we're doing can get out and be more accessible. This is an example of a publication that my university came out with to help publicize our work and explain what we're doing. If anybody's interested in this, I'll put my contact information and give out my business cards, and I'd like to send this to you so you can learn the basics about what we're doing. We also did a Reddit forum, if folks are aware of what this is. This is a global discussion that you can have online, where I was available for folks after writing a little bit about the research to ask me questions. We had Nepali journalists in part of this. We had earthquake survivors part of this. We had tourists that were in the earthquake as part of this. We had academics as part of this. And we actually ended up getting 46,000 views, and 5,900 people voted that our discussion should be at the top of the list of this Reddit forum. That is so many people, in my view, for us anthropologists who often can't get the word out. And it shows how much interest there is, not just on what's going on in Nepal, but that this is a global question. Disasters don't discriminate. We have hurricanes all over the world. We just had one in the United States. We have many anthropogenic disasters that happen. And I know that disasters aren't always the same. The same earthquake with the same magnitude in Mexico City, for example, caused very little damage compared to what the earthquake in Nepal caused. And this is based on how vulnerabilities interact with these natural hazards. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. What were the vulnerabilities here in Nepal that made this a natural disaster and not just a natural hazard? We also have written a bunch of blogs, and these blogs are available online, and we just keep updating people to learn more about what we're doing and know what kind of results we're having. We're trying to bring to life the stories of the people that we're working with, because by and large, the communities that we're working in are invisible, and nobody knows these stories. And the attention from the earthquake gets put on very particular places, charismatic places that people, for example, have raised money for. Everyone knows the story of Langtang, for example, in the earthquake, yeah? That's a charismatic place. There's not as many households in Langtang as there are in other VDCs and now municipalities in Rasua. And we'll talk about that, inequality. And it's not just Langtang, it's just an example. Okay, how did we pick our sites in our study? We selected 2 of the most highly impacted districts. We couldn't do all 14. It would have been great to have a huge team, and I'm excited that there are studies that are looking at all the districts. The Asia Foundation has also done some very good research in all of the districts, trying to look at some recovery. We decided to pick Gorkha. Everyone knows Gorkha is the epicenter of the April 2015 earthquake. And we decided to pick Rasua because Rasua has the highest ratio of injuries and deaths in the earthquakes compared to their population. They also had catastrophic impacts from landslides, not just the earthquake. So we wanted to get into some of the cascading effects of the earthquakes and not just the shape. We selected 2 VDCs, which don't exist anymore, in each district, and we wanted to compare those. So we went to, in November, December 2015, and we did censuses with the VDC secretaries in order to select VDCs that we thought would be appropriate for the study. Well, how did we pick these different VDCs? We decided that our primary criteria was going to be accessibility, the classic variable in Nepal to study a VDC at the roadhead and a VDC far from the roadhead. We also picked places that had more or less aid, places with more or less business or integration in the market, places that were in IDP camps and not, places that had hydropower development and not, because this variable seems to be extremely important in both places that we're working. And secondarily, we wanted to pick VDCs that were more and less ethnically and linguistically diverse, and VDCs that had more and less history of decentralized governance. Why the road? The road is such a factor that can change things in Nepal. And it's not a negative thing, and I'm not characterizing it as a negative thing at all. The road is something that makes a lot of change. And as we all know, the roads are growing in Nepal, and there's increased accessibility in places. Accessibility is in the past, and we hypothesize, and you'll see in our results, seems to really make a difference in your ability to source materials, to receive any help, to engage with NGOs, because it's really hard to get to inaccessible places. These are roadheads that are being built in our research areas that have grown since the last time that we did our research. This is the new highway just below Dunche and Rasua. This is a road in Gorka that's right near one of the villages we're working in, Yartsa, that maybe one day we'll get even closer to it. So these are the 4 places we picked. In Gorka, we selected Aruchinote VDC. Folks are probably aware of Arugat, yeah? On the Dading and Gorka border. Aruchinote is the VDC of Arugat, and it has north and south in it all of it is accessible by road, but the Arugat Bazaar is the place with the most population density. We picked Kashigao in Gorka, which is 1 to 2 days walk from Aruchinote. It's a more isolated area, has extreme risk of landslides, was not very far from Barpak, where the epicenter was, and so we looked at that as a good comparison. When it came to Rasua, we decided to pick Gatlan, which is about, depending on the traffic and the road, 4 to 8 hours drive from Dunche. And from there, we picked Haku VDC, which you probably have seen if you've been to Dunche across the valley. It's not accessible by road. There are no settlements accessible by road in that VDC. So we decided that that would be a nice comparison in Rasua. So our research design has these 4 areas that we're taking into account. Our data collection occurred between January and April 2016, over 10 weeks. We did household surveys with 100 randomly selected households in each VDC, totaling 400 households, which equated to 1,992 individuals. We also did in-depth qualitative interviews with 40 people, 10 per VDC, and we also mapped the entire sample. So we took GPS coordinates at the household of every single participating household so that we could look at the information spatially as well. We then did a second research phase. This is at 9 months after the earthquake, by the way. We then did a second research phase at 1.5 years after the earthquake, 10 weeks again, and we searched out those same 400 households. We were able to find 397 out of the 400 households. I really want to thank the advance of cell phones and technology in Nepal, because this would be impossible, I think, especially just in this short time period before. 3 households out-migrated completely, and we were unable to find them. But by and large, we were able to find 397. We created a survey that could be conducted by any household member, so that if we were not able to find the original respondent, we could still do the survey. We were able to find 357 of the original respondents, which I only can compliment my team 1,000,000 times for, and how difficult it was to find all those people. We also did focus groups with key consultants in phase 2 to put together people from inside and outside of the recovery. So people from the villages that we're working in, and then people working there, the government, NGOs, INGOs. And so we could see teachers with different perspectives on what the recovery was. And then we mapped all of the local infrastructure. Water sources, we mapped the nearest landslide, which we also supplemented with satellite data from NASA and ICIMOD. We were also able to map the schools, the temporary schools, the health posts, all of that. And so that we could then follow, in addition to that, we did community level surveys to understand where each community was at with the infrastructure recovery. So we wanted to see if they had their school destroyed, at what stage it was at, and what the process was of rebuilding all those things. In total, that gave us 3 data points. In the first survey, we did both a retrospective survey of how people were before the earthquake, and then we looked at how they were at 9 months after, and then we know where they're at 1.5 years after. Why did we pick 9 months? Why didn't we just run in there right after the earthquake? We picked 9 months because we wanted the government rebuilding program to have begun, and the $4 billion that was collected after the earthquake to be operationalized. So rather than just studying the relief phase, we decided to study the reconstruction, which is something different than what poured into Nepal immediately following the earthquake. Okay, in addition to that, we really wanted to focus on ethics and rapport building in our project so that this project made sense to the folks we were working with, that we had a Nepali team that would leave the project with more skills than they started with and be new leaders in the study of disaster and disaster recovery. We also wanted to train our research team in anthropological methods and in environmental social science. So we conducted 14 different modules of training our team that I open up to anybody here. They're online in a Dropbox with lectures and readings. And the idea behind that was to have the entire team on the same page before we went out into the field to collect the data. We then did a training of the trainers for phase 2. We brought in new researchers and had the researchers from phase 1 train the researchers from phase 2. We went to each community before we started doing the research and did very large community meetings so that we could introduce the project to the entire community. We gave out a handout in Nepali that explained what we were doing. Now, we were a little bit naive in the beginning, thinking everyone spoke Nepali where we work, and that is not true. There was very much Tamang and Gurung language also where we worked. So all of our community meetings were bilingual in Nepali and in the local language. We did 24 of those meetings, by the way. And then at the beginning of phase 2, we returned the research from phase 1, explained it, gave it out in a handout, gave out photos, made sure that we kept the word that we had, that we would be there, and then collected the data and explained why we were coming back and what we were doing. And then we wanted to triangulate our results by going into the communities and seeing what they thought about the results from phase 1 and phase 2 to see if they actually validated how they were feeling and what situation they're in, and also get updates a year after that so that now we have data that speaks to 2.5 years after the earthquake. We just finished doing 7 of those, and we're going to be doing a national workshop, which looks like 50 to 70 people on Wednesday, to also get feedback from other actors. As part of those workshops, we've invited 2 of the new ward representatives from each one of the communities to speak on their own behalf in the meetings rather than us just speaking on the results. So here's photos of us training the team in phase 1. You can see Dr. Chetri here, who is a senior technical advisor on the project, key to what we were doing. These are community meetings in phase 1. You can see Alyssa G facilitating right here in front of a large group in Tulahaku, which she was very good at. This is us training the trainers in phase 2, where we had our phase 1 research coordinators train our phase 2 research coordinators. All were new master's graduates from TU. Here we have the training of using the survey. And this is us in phase 2 returning the research from phase 1. So we're explaining some of the results on these flex banners, providing folks with some return from what they feel we collected in the first phase, and really wanted to make sure we still had buy-in for folks to be part of phase 2. These are group photos from our different phase 2 workshops. You can see they were quite well attended. This is one I'm actually in the photo. This is in phase 2 in gray. And this is now 6 weeks ago when we came back with the results. And we did focus groups, or a focus group with our research team to help figure out what was important and what do we need to present in the communities? What do we need to present to the INGOs? What is floating up to the top as something important here? You can see guest starring Dr. Chetri again here. And then this is us doing the local workshops where we're actually returning the results. This is fresh information within the last month of us being in Gorkha and Rasuwa, and everyone that you see here are newly elected government officials or representatives. And we wanted the ward representatives to represent their people. So, as they should in the new government, we gave them the results to disseminate to everyone instead of us. We also did one of these presentations in one of the existing displacement camps. We have been working in 7 displacement camps where folks from Rasuwa were relocated. 2 of them are still inhabited. This is in Boganitar, where we just were. This was actually 10 days ago. And in those meetings, we also created these big, they're actually wall-sized flex banners that have the maps that we created that are very accessible and photos from the different research phases so people can remember us. And we gave these as gifts to hang in the community buildings. So I'm going to give just a little bit of background on each place, and then I'm going to throw all the results at you. Okay, so Aruchinote has 977 households. This area has ballooned in population since 2000. It has become a functioning market area and bazaar area. It is populated by Nuari people, as well as Gurungs, Gales, Magars. There's a Dalit population. It's very ethnically diverse. There's Muslims there. This is also, and it's just in the newspaper this morning, the area of the planned inundation zone of the Budagandaki Dam, one of the largest dams in Nepal's history. I think folks here are aware that it's up in the air now who's going to be funding the dam. It seems that Nepal is going to be funding the dam instead of China, and this remains in discussion. What we did here is we did a computer simulation of the inundation zone. All of our households, as you can see, are black and yellow, and you can see how many of those households will be underwater. And I want you to keep that in mind, because recovery, when you're about to be relocated, is very different than recovery if you're about to stay in the same place. The bazaar area is here. You can see that on a clear day. You can see Mount Manaslu. This is also the new launching point for the Manaslu Base Camp trek, the Tsum Valley trek. People go there for the Ganesh Himal Base Camp trek. There's within 1 hour's driving distance up the road from Arugat is a place called Soti that is becoming a very popular place for tourists to go. Remember, all of this is going to be underwater. In the northern area, in the VDC, it's like a different world, okay? People up there have not rebuilt their homes. They have not received the same amount of aid that they've gotten in the southern area. You can probably think, so why? It has to do with accessibility, right? Whether or not the road goes to these other places, how much it costs to transport materials. This is not a temporary school. This is a school in the upper wards that is functioning with earthquake damage. There's Mount Manaslu. This is what it looks like. It's a complete contrast up there, with many people still in their temporary shelters. This is some of the stats on the dam. I'm sure folks have heard about this. Folks that are into hydrology and other things probably be more interested. I was advised the other day that folks are afraid this dam is too tall and will cause a natural hazard just in the amount of water it's going to create in the reservoir. I do not know much about this stuff. I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I am just giving you the information. This is giving you some of the idea of what's going on there. Because people are not knowing where their future's going, they're just patching their houses. So this is a patch job on earthquake damage, obviously not to the building codes, and obviously potentially precarious. It's also a place where a lot of sand is sourced for cement in the rebuilding of cement homes, which are considered more resilient to earthquakes than wood homes, and that is going to be in the inundation zone. And as I told you, it's a launching spot for a lot of tourists. We were blown away this tourist season by Soti being completely full and not being able to get any rooms for people going on the Tsum Valley trek and going to Manaslu Base Camp. We also ran into heroes in the area. This is a dog that saved the lives of some folks in the earthquake by going to get his master while folks were buried in rubble. And actually, these folks were able to get out because this dog alerted them, and we always want to show him because he's a friend of the project. Okay, Kashigao, 1 to 2 day walk from Aruchinote. I want you to notice all the red on this map. Those are all landslides mapped from satellite imagery. This area is extremely precarious. These landslides are activated annually by the monsoon rains. If you notice, these are all landslides caused by the earthquake, and there are landslides above the village as well that are threatening it. This is the settlement of Yartsa. It's broken into 3 areas, Yartsa, Chamakarka, and Kashigao. And they also have different levels of accessibility, even though they're not accessible by road. This is Yartsa settlement. Obviously, it's very difficult to get to. And sometimes, as you know, VDCs are thrown together with different wards, and those folks may or may not have much in common. This is all Gurung, Gale, and there's a small community of Dalits here. But it's very different, these folks who migrated here, from the folks in the other 2 communities. This is an active landslide that people have to cross every day to get fodder. These are people here carrying fodder. This landslide is activated by the monsoons every year. It's extremely dangerous to cross. You have to remake the trail every time. This is what it looks like in the middle of one of the landslides in that area. And actually, it's quite interesting. People are harvesting the rocks from those landslides as building materials because the metamorphic rock that are in their villages is brittle and not very good for using for stones and houses or bricks. So a lot of these landslides have been harvested and over-harvested. the rocks that came down because they're more stronger igneous rocks. There's also a very strong tradition in this area of work exchange. This is an example of women from the village co-building a school with foreign donation, which is an example of connectivity. Folks here had very high examples of helping each other in each other's fields, and also helping to rebuild each other's houses in the earthquake, which I'll get to in a bit. Okay, now we're in Gatlang. Gatlang's on the Tamang Heritage Trail. If folks remember the TRPAP program in the 1990s, this was one of the jewels of that program in order to reinforce cultural tourism and bring people away from Langtang and have them go to places where folks weren't getting any benefit from tourism. It's broken into two settlements, Gatlang and Gray. And those two areas might as well be two different VDCs, because it's, again, like night and day, what the recovery looks like in Gatlang versus what it looks like in Gray. So in Gatlang, it's known as the Black Village because of the architecture. People use this wood slate on their roofs with stones. Obviously, you can see after the earthquake, the Black Village doesn't have the same aesthetic anymore. People in the area are extremely concerned about this, as it might affect tourism and other ideas there. Here you can see folks trying to innovate in the recovery by using the CGI tin and then putting the slate on top. Obviously, it's an area I've talked about it for tourism. People come here to see Langtang Himal, to experience some of Tamang culture. It's a place where some families are benefiting from tourism and others aren't. There are children in the village. Some of them are sent to boarding schools by their parents that might get sponsorship from tourists. But those are a minority compared to the folks in the village who are herding and farming. What you're seeing here, which by and large is still the vocation of the village, especially with the road to the village not being that accessible at times. Here's some picture at the top of Gatlang is Parbati Gunda. Folks might have heard of this place. It's a sacred lake that people go to for spiritual power, both Hindus and Buddhists. This area also provides drinking water for the Gatlang village. This is Gray. This is where the road ends. You can actually see the road end in this picture right here, and where they're trying to build it and make it bigger. Okay? And this area, you can see very clearly from Dunche, and you can access it directly from Safrubesi without going on the road. And you can also access Haku VDC, or the VDC formerly known as Haku, through this trail. Lastly, Haku VDC, I want everyone's eyes to be on all this red over here. These are catastrophic landslides that took out entire settlements. These folks were reorganized into 7 different displacement camps. 5 out of 7 of those displacement camps are now gone, and those folks have tried to go back home on precarious slopes, trails that don't exist anymore. I tried very hard to hike from Haku VDC here to this area, and there was no trail to do it anymore, and it was extremely dangerous. The areas of folks that are still there are Naishing, Sanuhaku, Haku Besi, which folks have returned to, and Tulo Haku. And this area is considered to be one of the most impacted by the earthquakes, similar to Langtang. Here's some photos of Haku VDC. Now, Tulo Haku and Haku got to experience 2 disasters. After the earthquake, a fire occurred in the village and burned more than 30 homes. So not only were the homes destroyed from the earthquake, they were then burned. You can only imagine what that might have been like for the people there and what they went through again and again. Here you can see the damage from the fire, houses that are just like ghosts. Yeah? This is just to show you how much time has passed. This is the school in the area, and the school here has had so much vegetation grow in it that it almost looks like it's been like that for years. There are catastrophic landslides you have to cross to even be able to get through Haku. These are active in the monsoons, just like Kashigao. This is me standing in the middle of the landslide with Haku Besi just under me. Try and think of the perspective here and how many meters it is between me and the bottom there. Very dangerous. The trail continually needs to be remade. One of the communities, Sanuhaku, geologists from the government have come to and said that it's not safe for people to live there anymore. And so they have proposed that they relocate to this area, which is near Naishing and Gray. Also, Haku VDC is the area where we saw the most Christianity changing, or missionaries coming in after the earthquake. We did a study on Christianity in the area and found that the average time that people had been Christian in Haku was 3/4 of a year. And there are new churches there. At times they're a new building. At other times it's a monastery where they put the crosses on. Often the Christianity is associated with modernity. It's associated with the tourists that come and the religion that's there. It also forgives people of expensive rituals in Buddhism that you then no longer have to pay for. So it's debated why this is happening. There's also evidence in Nepal of this occurring and people converting back to Hinduism and Buddhism after the development that the Christianity brought goes away. In Rasua, here are the 7 camps that we worked in. Again, only 2 of them are still in use. And these are the catastrophic landslides that took out those communities. So you can only imagine, Gogane and Tiru are right here. And parts of those communities are completely gone. It almost caused a landslide dam outburst flood. This is the road that was created for the Upper Trisuli Dam. And when the earthquake occurred, so much sediment came in, it changed the course of the river. This is the school in Hakubesi. It still has the lessons on the board from the Friday before the earthquake. And nothing has changed there, and it was a catastrophically affected community. These are the displacement camps. I hope folks have seen these. There were displacement camps in Kathmandu. They still exist. And there are folks that also don't have a plan for relocation at this time. We were in a camp just last week, right here, and this is a camp about a year ago. In the camps, you have amazing innovations. This is a side garden created between 2 temporary shelters so people can still grow the greens. Life goes on in these areas. You can see the political flags that are here and how important the elections are in those areas. This is also examples of things going on in the camp. This gentleman asked us to have his photo in our presentations. He lost his entire family in those landslides and had a catastrophic brain injury. He's a leader in one of the camps and really is a spokesperson for trying to figure out how the communities are going to relocate. I know it's difficult to look at that, but it does bring to life what it was like for those people. So now I'm going to share with you the results. I hope that you feel like you have an idea of the communities we work in, the differences and similarities that exist in them in general. Again, we worked with 400 households, 397 in phase 2, 1,992 total people. By and large, the average age of people in our study was 42. In our first phase, amazingly, we had 199 females and 201 male respondents. That really happened. Alyssa will verify it for you. And we didn't actually try and do that, and it's amazing that we did get our sex ratio almost equal. In our sample, the religion of folks was predominantly Buddhist, then Hindu, Christian, and other. And lastly, we worked with mostly Tamangs, Gurungs, Gales, Nuaris, Brahmins, Chetris, and other ethnic groups, including Dalits. Damage to primary house from earthquakes. What made our entire sample have things in common is that 99.2% of all the households were damaged or destroyed. You can see the ratio of number damaged and destroyed. Remember the 700,000 buildings damaged or destroyed from the earthquake. We're right in there with what is going on in the other districts. 100% of all community infrastructure in the villages we worked in was destroyed. Okay, that means the schools, the health posts, the community buildings. All 4 of our communities have these same demographics. 99.2 because 4 households in Aruchinote didn't have to leave their primary house. That is all for our entire study. Able to return home from temporary shelter. In phase 1, only 1% after 9 months were able to go home from living in the temporary shelter. After a year and a half, 44%. But look at the differences here. In Kashigao and Gorkha, 92% of our sample were living back in their primary houses after a year and a half. Only 8% of our sample were back in Gatlam. So something's going on here. Why are those differences? Now, none of these folks had returned to houses built to the building codes. Okay, and that has added a whole nother problem. But most of the communities that we worked in, it took at least the first payout from the government of 50,000 rupees, which then engaged them in the recovery process. Issues trying to rebuild. In our first phase, 55% of our samples said they had some problem rebuilding their house. After a year and a half, 92% of our samples said they had issues rebuilding. That is because of the government rebuilding program starting. It's also because, something that we were talking about at the beginning, it's a lot easier to do relief than it is to do reconstruction. lots of NGOs mobilized with INGOs to give out blankets, to give out food, to give out what we called quick response. But that stuff went away really quick. And I'll talk about that too. The livelihoods in our VDCs are mainly agriculture and livestock raising, although we do have business and service in Arutinote and definitely representation of wage labor. But by and large, our sample are primarily herders and farmers. Okay, so now I'm going to give you the multivariate statistics that we did, and I'm only going to give you a taste of our methods. If you're interested in them, let me know. We can talk more about them. They're quite complex, and I could take a lot more time. So I think you're more interested in the results than you are in the methodology of the statistics. We use something called non-metric multidimensional scaling ordination. And what non-metric multidimensional ordination, or NMDS, does is it tells you similarities and differences in multiple variables, both dependent and independent variables. So you can pack a lot into this. That's why folks in ecology use this, because we know that systems, including humans in those systems, have a lot of variables that affect what's going on in them, not just reducing it to simple things. So we use this by looking at both samples. So we took the samples from phase 1 and the samples of phase 2, and we put them together. This technique allows us to look at similar patterns of recovery across the sample and then within each VDC, because each VDC has their own story, but the sample also tells a bigger story. We constructed this out of 397 households, so we could compare phase 1 to phase 2. And our first thing that we did is we took those recovery indicators and we did something called an ordination plot. And this statistical test takes all the responses of those recovery indicators, which were 48, and crunches them down to one coordinate in an XY plot. And this is called a dissimilarity matrix. And this test utilizes a dissimilarity matrix to see which households had similar outcomes in the recovery and which ones had different outcomes in the recovery. Then we conducted something called vector fitting. What vector fitting is we overlay the different domains of resilience: accessibility and hazard exposure, livelihood diversity, institutional context, connectivity, and social memory, and we see if those can help predict the recovery outcomes. And that would help tell us, well, what is helping with resilience to the earthquake? What is hurting different people in terms of how they're recovering? And vector fitting is basically equivalent to running thousands of regressions. So it's unbelievably precise. It's showing how these different variables correlate with what's going on in the recovery indicators. That's all I'm going to tell you about the NMDS, and if you want to know more, please ask. Okay, so let's summarize the results. This is the fun part, right? Let's see what this said. Let's see what's important. Across our entire sample and in every single location, hazard exposure and livelihood diversity were the two most important variables. It happened every single time we ran the test. That means that social memory, connectivity were important, as well as institutional context, but not as important as hazard exposure and livelihood diversity. Households with more reliance on natural resources, those that herd, farm, and collect forest products. So think of Arutinote. You have 2 wards that are in the market area and 7 wards that are not. The ones that are not were experiencing more negative recovery outcomes or were recovering slower. Households with less diversified livelihoods, meaning they have less ways to bring in income streams, were experiencing worse recovery outcomes. That means if you're focused more on herding and farming only, it's harder for you to bounce back. That includes the fact that you're relying on natural resources. Households that were more accessible, meaning closer to the road, trail, or helicopter pad, all of those variables were considered accessibility, or we found them as accessibility in our study. Those households, and also the ones that had less hazard exposure, had more positive outcomes. So those that were closer to the road and that were further from the landslides were doing better. Households with KET were recovering faster than those with BARI. KET are the irrigated fields at lower elevation. BARI are the non-irrigated fields at higher elevation. Bari are much more marginal, right? There are more Bari than there are Kets in our sample. Those with Kets were recovering faster. Here's some examples of cascading effects of hazards. It's not just about the earthquake. Fires, landslides. Look at this landslide's proximity to this settlement. You know, everybody see this, the folks living down here? Look at the size of this landslide in proportion to that settlement. Also, there are other types of hazards, like weather. This is a windstorm that was experienced in Gatlan, which destroyed a lot of the temporary shelters. Can you only imagine, after experiencing the earthquake and having your home destroyed, what it's like to experience a windstorm to your temporary house? Remember, 92% of Gatlan were in temporary houses until a year and a half after the earthquake. Here's some folks that just trying to bring this to life. After the earthquake, people are worried about going to the forest during the rainy seasons. Landslides have become more frequent during the rain seasons and pose more threat to us. Trails are bad. We have to get firewood from the forest. We don't have gas for cooking. There are chances of rocks falling off cliffs and landslides when we are in the forest for collecting firewood. The landslides are occurring everywhere in the forest. You might have seen them yesterday. In Kashigaon, water is flowing downhill onto the village because of the landslide. The landslides have increased more in the summer after the earthquake. Plants have been swept away by the water. We see lots of cracks in the forest, and we have to cross those cracks to walk in and out of the forest. There's no grazing land because of the earthquake. Some people don't even have their cattle. First, there's not enough space. Second, the earthquake took away the grazing land. It is like this. It's been almost 2 years since we left the village and agricultural activities. Our fields are full of weeds, cracks formed, lands have subsided, and fields are damaged. More results. There is an increase in civic participation and informal communication related to disaster preparedness after the quakes. We saw more participation in credit and savings groups, farmers groups, cooperatives, women's groups, mothers groups. Although in our Chinote, for example, because the dam is potentially going to be built, we found apathy among local institutions. People didn't want to be part of those because they didn't feel like it mattered because they're being relocated. We saw institutional participation correlated with recovery outcomes in some locations. In some locations, people in these institutions were recovering faster. In other ones, it didn't matter. Connectivity between affected households and national and international actors like NGOs and remittances from abroad also help shape outcomes, but less strongly than other variables. Institutional participation between phase 1 and phase 2. Look at the uptick. Mothers groups, 7% to 22%. Women's groups, similar. Credit and savings groups. Farmers groups. Social memory from previous hazards correlated with positive outcomes. People who had been through landslides were better at handling landslides. People who had never been through landslides were having a harder time with it. Local knowledge related to agro-pastoral livelihoods was being used in the recovery by inaccessible households. When you're marginal and living far away, trying to use the grazing area, you're using knowledge that's been passed down from generation to generation to be able to do that. We saw more people doing that in the areas that were more marginal. The further you were away, the more difficult your life was, the more you were using this ecological knowledge or social memory. Social capital was a factor in assisting with material reconstruction through loans and work exchange. There were 248 loans taken within our 400 households to rebuild their houses. 73% of those loans were from family and friends at low interest rates. People can't get loans from banks. They can get them from family and friends. We also saw people using Parma to rebuild their homes, especially the Gurung and Gale folks. Those folks did not bring in skilled carpenters to rebuild their houses. They brought in their neighbors to rebuild their houses, which potentially accounts for that 92% uptick in how many were able to return to their original homes. Lastly, and really importantly, households facing relocation or resettlement felt that they would be disconnected from their culture and place through being resettled, and they preferred to be together and not broken apart. When we were in Boganitar IDP camp, Folks there are afraid that they're going to relocate 10 households at a time in different areas, and their culture will be fragmented and destroyed. This also brings in the culture question. Place matters, and people's cultures are interwoven with place. By resettling people from Gogane and Tiru somewhere else, that is going to affect their livelihoods. Also, just the idea of having to grow at different elevations brings in the thought of having to change the crops you grow, or potentially to use pesticides. There was definitely a difference in recovery outcomes between 9 months and 1.5 years. This is one of our hypotheses. The idea being that after you have a major disturbance, that disturbance causes rapid reorganization of people's livelihoods and their connection to place. This then could reconfigure how they interact with the environment, which in the resilience literature is called a regime shift or a critical transition. This might be evidence of critical transitions that we need more time to study. We have put out 3 more years of funding. We're hoping to get it. Everybody here, please do a puja for us so that we can continue this project and we can keep following these households for more years to be able to answer these questions. This is an example of an NMDS ordination plot, and the average results of each community are circled. VDC 1 is Aruchinote, VDC 4 is Haku, VDC 2 and 3 are Gatlang and Kashigao. Notice that Gatlang and Kashigao have similar recovery outcomes. Remember, Gatlang is accessible by road, Kashigao is not. What is going on here? Think about some of these ideas. We mostly use parma or work exchange in the field, but families who do not have someone to exchange parma hire other people instead. We perform 1 day of parma to build a new house, and then we hire people for other days. Parma is an extremely common cultural factor utilized in this area. This is a bunch of neighbors helping to rebuild a new house to the rebuilding codes. Now I want you to notice how little that house is. It's probably 10 feet by 10 feet. The reason being is that the 3 lakh that people are getting to rebuild their house is only enough to build something this size, especially with the inflation caused by having to carry the cement and other products from the roadhead. So that 3 lakh almost becomes 1.5 lakh because of how much more the cement costs, how much more the rebar costs, etc. And you can really get a feeling both of the unity within this culture and how people are working together. Actually, this gentleman here is one of our local research coordinators, and we had to wait that morning because he was slated to do work exchange to help build his neighbor's house. So I came and filmed it instead so that we could get a little bit of an idea of this. Now, this was a really common occurrence in Kashigao. This was not happening at all in Gatlang. As I told you, 73% of our sample took loans from family and friends. Kashigao was the area where most of these loans were taken in our sample compared to Rasua. Gatlang is the place in our research that has the most INGOs. So that's interesting. How does a place with more NGOs and more connectivity is recovering at the same rate as a place like Gatlang that has less NGOs? That's interesting. Here's some quotes from folks in Gatlang that might help bring this to life. Many organizations came here, but they first focused primarily on rescue or relief and providing immediate relief acts. However, these organizations did not work for a sustainable thing, but only on distributing relief aid. I can tell you, as someone who's worked with NGOs, it's a lot easier to get relief money than it is to get long-term recovery money. People are very moved right after the earthquake happens. People forget that the earthquake happens after 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. The research says it can take up to 10 years for communities to recover. People hope that the government will do something. I don't think they have any hope that organizations will do anything for them now. So this is an important factor here, that people are feeling that the organizations actually hurt rather than helped by bringing in quick relief, rather than thinking about sustainable programs. Moving into Aruchinote, which might help explain why they're different in the recovery, here's another computer simulation of the inundation zone in the Budagandaki River. Think about what it's like that you're supposed to be relocated, but you don't know where that's going to be. The government has not paid the money out for the relocation, And even the dam is in question on whether or not to rebuild. We've had estimates from 3 to 5 years to up to 10 years, and some people think it might take 20 years for the dam to be built. Do you rebuild your house, or do you wait? Hey or nay in this situation? My house is not repaired. I've heard that a new house should be constructed after getting the relief grant. I'm quite confused whether I should repair the old house or construct a new one. The dam construction and relocation are like an additional earthquake for us. I think that one resonates a lot. These people feel like they're stuck. Their land is worthless now. They're not allowed to sell it, yet they're in this situation. This is an ordination plot. What it's showing here are the accessible households in Arutinote versus the inaccessible ones. And notice there's basically a direct line dividing the two. This is showing that there's high variation between accessible and inaccessible in Arutinote, meaning that the people near the road are getting the resources and the people far from the road are not. I want to talk a little bit also about Haku. This is Tihar last year. I was lucky enough to share this. It's Tihar in a Buddhist village, and they celebrate Tihar there as well. And this is us going from house to house, as people do, and singing songs during the ceremony. And what was so interesting in this area, speaking of social capital and culture in this place, is that they created a new song. They were singing about how Tulohaku was destroyed by the earthquake and the fire. And they were going house to house to collect money in order to pool it together to repair the trails from landslides affected by the earthquake and subsequent monsoons. This is another ordination plot showing the difference between recovery in the camps and not in the camps. Those in the red are in the camps, those in the camp in blue are not, and you can clearly see there's a difference there. I'll bring that to life in this graph. This is the entire sample. We have a statistically significant difference between accessible and inaccessible households in their recovery. And if you look at it in each place, you'll notice that that division is there. There's a little bit more variation in non-accessible households, and of course all of Haku is not accessible, but we saw this pattern across the entire study. Even though Gray and Gatlang belong to the same VDC, the two villages are separated by this hill. Earlier we said that Gatlang is a corner place, less accessible, but now an all-weather road is reached there. And because of the Ganesh Himal, the place has benefited more from tourism. Ours is not a good place. It is not a good place. It is very much a corner place. The villagers work together to bring this Krishi Sadat, or agricultural road. This road has come, but it has no use. Vehicles cannot come here during the rainy season, and even during the winter when it snows. The road will be blocked at the hilltop. So the road works only for 2 or 3 months, and when there is no rain or snow. I see this village has many problems. So across our full sample, as I told you, hazard exposure, livelihood, diversity came out every time. In particular, access to grazing areas for herding and selling of livestock products was the most important thing. And then Bari, as I told you, was the second most important thing. For our entire sample, these are the things that came out the most. When we go into our different sites, and again, we're looking at R as our indicator, R being the first one, or R squared, depending on the study, which shows how much each variable is contributing to each one of the axes in that graph. We then would look at p-value as the second indicator. I'm only going to show you the ones with the R value. Here's Arutinote with hazard exposure and livelihood diversity coming out. Kashigaon with the same result. Gatlang with the same result. And Haku with the same result. Now I'm just going to close with telling you a little bit about what the folks in the villages thought about these results and how these results have been triangulated and what people think about them. In all of our 7 workshops that we did, everybody validated the results and felt they were complementary towards our research process and that we returned and did what we said we would. All locations felt that the 3 lot provided by the government was not sufficient to construct houses to the building codes, forcing the construction of much smaller houses than those that preceded the earthquake. This is also a risk that people will build a small house to get the money and then build off that house structures not to code. All locations felt that the cascading effects from the earthquake, such as landslides, shifted water sources, are making recovery worse as the time passes, and our data reinforces this. That means that people are perceiving that the earthquake and where they were at directly after was better than it is now. Obviously, the future is highly uncertain for people in that situation. All locations considered accessibility to be a driving factor in locating building materials and not paying additional costs to transport to inaccessible areas. All locations felt that the Nepal Rebuilding Authority should do more than assess damage to homes, such as helping to control future landslides. All locations considered INGO and NGO assistance as not sustainable. That means that every single place thought the NGO programs were short-term and that were not long-term programs that helped them recover their livelihoods. Just to give you an idea of what happened to the help, phase 1's on the left, phase 2's on the right. 39% got help from family and friends in phase 1, that fell to 15. 95% from the government, that fell to 19. 88% from NGOs, that fell to 3.8% in phase 2. 74% from INGOs, and that fell to 17% in phase 2. Aruchinote felt people were interested in reconstructing their homes, but they don't know when they will be relocated because of the hydropower project, so they're not sure if they should rebuild at all. Since Aruchinote has been declared as an inundation zone, people have stopped selling their land. This is largely affecting people's businesses. Business people are not sure how they'll be able to pay for loans. They would like the government to forgive the loans that they took. Some people would like to start new businesses. However, they do not have money to invest as banks will not grant them loans as they are in the inundation zone. After the dam is constructed, it will create a new ecological condition that people are afraid will change the microclimate of Aruchinote. Many people have purchased expensive and small pieces of land in Arugat in order to start businesses, but now the land is going to be inundated, so they have nothing. People have kept their livestock in CGI tin sheds. The metal makes the shed hot, resulting in their livestock losing weight. Different organizations have come to bring relief materials to the community, but our research team are the people with whom they can share their feelings and viewpoints. They did not expect relief from us. In Kashigao, some households have not received rebuilding funds because engineers missed their households when they were examining the location. These people whose homes were missed asked that we share this situation at the national level. The forest is now highly degraded due to people obtaining wood to rebuild their homes. They made a rule that each household was only allowed 1 tree. However, for 600 households, that means we have to cut down 600 trees. They would like the NGOs and INGOs to stop duplicating each other's work. Communities have complained that the government is unstable, giving the example that the government is like a wavering leaf on the water, moving back and forth. Here's some examples of rebuilding in Kashigao. Notice I didn't show you any pictures of rebuilding in Aruchinote because none's going on. Look how little those houses are, by the way. Some people say that it's about as much money as to build a house the size of a bathroom. Here's some timber being cut in the forest, just to give you an idea of what that looks like. In Gatlang, the representatives are worried about maintaining the Black Village reputation. Because of the architectural style, the reputation is important for tourism. The community has realized that CGI sheets are not suitable for permanent use in Gatlang. They cause moisture that come inside that makes the conditions quite cold. They're not good, obviously, in the wintertime. They're not very good at dealing with snow. Everyone here, I'm sure, has been under tin roof when the rain comes, and it's quite a unsettling feeling. Communities are following the government building codes only so that they can get the rebuilding money. They're not able to build a sufficient house with the rebuilding money. They're only able to build a one-room house. The one-room house looks like a bathroom. It's the size of a bathroom. People have reduced the heights of their homes in order to reduce the amount of damage caused by future earthquakes. They've innovated their own architecture in order to deal with the potential of future hazards. Here's some examples of rebuilding in Gatlang that we witnessed about 2 weeks ago. Notice the deconstruction of the roof here and recycling building materials. Something I found really interesting is folks in Gatlang said that the rebuilding codes are causing the social divisions to come out, because those that can afford a concrete house have a lot more money to be able to do so, and those that can only afford wood, it's very clear. So you're seeing a difference between rich and poor. In Haku, they've reconstructed many homes by taking loans. They have a problem with funding appropriate lands on which to rebuild their homes. The stones of which their homes were reconstructed before the earthquake have fallen down or piled on the ground. They have to find a new spot to rebuild because they don't know what to do with all the stones their homes were built out of, as they cannot reuse them if they build their homes according to the government codes. Haku is the second most affected area in Rasua district after Langtang, but they did not receive as much support and help as Langtang has received. Langtang has already been built, rebuilt, and revived, but Haku is still suffering. Haku was once called a red alert area, and organizations were not allowed to work there. Nothing has been done in Haku in comparison to Langtang. Here's some examples of the little bit of rebuilding we saw in Haku. This is the one earthquake to code house that we found. We could not find the owner of the house, and the house was locked up, and no one else in this area had a house that was rebuilt to code. In the IDP camps, it was very hard to adjust to the hot weather because they're at lower elevation, and the climate they're facing. Their preference is adaptation in colder areas. Before, the District Development Committee said that Haku is not suitable for settlement and didn't allow NGOs and INGOs to work there. However, now they're changing their words and saying that Haku is a safe place to live, which is really far from the truth. The government announced that they'll provide 2 lakh rupees to buy the lands for the displaced people. They interacted with Samaritan's Purse, an INGO, and the government to do so. The government at that time agreed to provide land at Kalde and started plotting it. However, after the local level elections, the new government denied providing them that land, and they feel they have to start all over again. The newly elected local government is not allowing NGOs and INGOs to work in the camps. The people of the camps are planning to collect their own funds and open an account in the bank to get direct support for relocation and reconstruction. The people in the camps want to stay together and require an area where they can all live together and share a similar culture, and are afraid of being broken apart. And then I just want to end going back to the beginning. So I want us to think about what is resilience in these contexts. For who and for what? Is resilience your ability to diversify your livelihood? Is your resilience your ability to use your social memory? Is your resilience not living in areas that are exposed to hazards, which correlate with inaccessibility and poverty? How do these findings illustrate different vulnerabilities in the case study areas? One of the great contributions of anthropology to disaster studies is the idea that natural hazards are not always disasters. You need vulnerability plus a natural hazard to get a disaster. So how can we look at our findings as vulnerabilities? Livelihood diversity or lack of, is that a vulnerability? Hazard exposure, is that a vulnerability? Let's think about things in terms of vulnerabilities so we can understand why the earthquake had the effects that it had. How do these results predict future changes for these households within coupled human and natural systems? How are these households going to change? What are their trajectories in the future? We already saw them changing rapidly just between a 6-month period. What types of crops are they going to grow? What types of livestock are they going to have? We saw a big uptake in wage labor and people out migrating in the area in order to make money because they didn't have other options. We even saw larger incidents of people renting their homes because they needed to find new places to live. And lastly, what are the implications of these findings to future disaster preparedness and response in Nepal? We hear that there's going to be another earthquake potentially in West Nepal. And also, as I said, natural hazards happen all over the world. They happen in the West, they happen in the non-West. They happen in high mountain areas, they happen in low areas. We just saw a hurricane in the United States that caused devastating damage in Houston, although the focus was only on Houston and maybe not the rural areas, which might sound similar to what happened here in Nepal. So I want to have you think about what bridge we should take for the future. This is an example of an old bridge next to a new bridge. Should we use old ideas and try and incorporate them with new ones for interesting new solutions? Should we rely on the reservoir of culture in Nepal and people's experience living on the land for folks to take that bridge? What is the road that we should take in this recovery? I want to end with this quote. I'd like to thank those who carried out this research. We got an opportunity to share our opinions and curiosity, which we're building inside our heart minds. I feel happy about it. This research has a plan to disseminate and share our experiences and curiosity across all of the districts affected by the earthquake and with the government and non-government agencies. I'm thankful to the research team. Thanks to you people, the research team, as well for enduring hardship in coming here. Thanks to the organization from where you have come. I want to thank everybody. It took a lot of people to make this research happen, including an affiliation with the Office of International Relations here at TU. And we are funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation, as well as Portland State University.